What happens when someone with a little bit of power meets someone with the power to destroy them, and neither one knows it yet? That question hung in the air above Terminal 4 of John F. Kennedy International Airport on a Tuesday morning in March. The terminal was a cathedral of human anxiety, with colossal glass walls gleaming weakly in the morning light. But inside, the atmosphere was thick. It smelled like stale coffee, jet fuel, and something else. The faint metallic scent of 1,000 nervous travelers, all worried about being late, being judged, being turned away. Thousands of people flowed through the checkpoint like a river of baggage and bodies. This was where status evaporated. No matter how much money you had in the bank, how important you thought you were, how successful your career had been at the security checkpoint, everyone was reduced to the same thing: their shoes, their belt, their dignity. That's what made it dangerous. When you strip away status and context and humanity, you're left with just one thing: power. And power without accountability corrodes everything. In exactly 8 minutes, 2 people would meet at Checkpoint Bravo. One of them had power he didn't deserve. The other had power she hadn't revealed yet. And neither of them understood that the choices they were about to make would ripple out through an entire industry, changing thousands of lives forever. But that's the thing about power, isn't it? The people who abuse it think it's infinite. They think it's permanent. They think the person standing in front of them has no leverage, no connections, no ability to fight back. They are usually wrong. By the end of this day, one man would lose everything: his job, his pension, his freedom. His entire identity would be stripped away, reduced to a prison number and a federal conviction. And it would not be because he was evil. It would be because he was careless. Because he believed that his position made him untouchable. Because he looked at a young black woman in a hoodie and saw someone he could hurt without consequences. He was about to learn the most expensive lesson of his life. But first we need to understand how we got here. We need to understand Mark Harrison. We need to understand what 16 years of failure and humiliation can do to a man. We need to understand how resentment calcifies into something darker. We need to understand how someone becomes a predator wearing a government uniform. And then we need to meet Isabella Reeves. We need to understand why she was at that checkpoint in the first place. We need to understand what she was looking for and what she was about to find. Because this is a story about power. But it is also a story about what happens when power meets a woman who refuses to be diminished by it. Mark Harrison had been having the same morning for 16 years. The alarm went off at 5:30 in the morning. He did not move right away. He just lay there in his studio apartment in Queens, staring at the water-stained ceiling, listening to the sound of his neighbor's television bleeding through the paper-thin walls. He thought about calling in sick. He did this every morning, thought about it for exactly 30 seconds before dragging himself out of bed. He was 48 years old, and his life looked exactly like he feared it would when he was young. The shower was lukewarm. The water pressure was weak. His reflection in the mirror showed a man who looked older than his years, with lines around his eyes that seemed to deepen every month. He had put on weight in his middle, despite barely eating anything substantial. His hair was thinning. His face was permanently flushed, like he was always on the edge of anger, which, if he was being honest with himself, he usually was. He put on his uniform. It hung on him differently now, loose in some places, tight in others. It looked like a costume from someone else's life. Once he had felt proud wearing this uniform. Once it had meant something. It had meant he was part of something bigger than himself. It had meant he was important. That was a long time ago. The drive to JFK took 45 minutes. 45 minutes every morning watching other people's cars pass him. Their owners going to important meetings in important buildings, making important money, living important lives. He drove in the right lane, going the speed limit, never speeding, never taking risks. Even his driving was small. Even his movement through the world was constrained. When he arrived at the airport, he parked in the employee lot. He grabbed his badge from the glove compartment and clipped it to his belt. That badge was the only thing that made him feel like anything. The only tangible proof that he had power over something, over someone. Mark Harrison had been with the TSA for 16 years. He had hit the ceiling of his career 10 years ago. There were no promotions coming. There were no raises that actually kept up with inflation. There was no ladder to climb. There was just endless days at the checkpoint, and the knowledge that this was it. This was his life now, and his life was over. His wife had left him 3 years ago. She had said it was not anything dramatic, nothing he had done to her specifically. She just could not spend the rest of her life with someone so angry all the time. She had left for a man who was younger and still believed the world owed him things. Mark was glad when she left. He had learned to hate the pity in her eyes. Child support took half his paycheck now. He had an ex-wife, 2 kids he barely saw, an apartment that cost too much, and a job that meant nothing. He had 16 years of watching younger officers get promoted while he stayed in place. He had 16 years of watching supervisors treat him like an afterthought. He had 16 years of being invisible to everyone except the people he could make uncomfortable. That is where his power lived. In discomfort, in fear, in the knowledge that he could make someone's day worse with just a word, a gesture, a decision. When you are nobody to everyone else, making someone else nobody, for a moment feels like becoming somebody. He had learned exactly who to target too. The ones traveling alone. The ones who looked like they did not belong in first class or business lounges. The ones who seemed most likely to apologize rather than fight back. And increasingly, the young black women traveling by themselves. Something about them triggered something in him that he did not examine too closely. By the time Mark Harrison had driven to JFK this morning, his supervisor had already called him at 5 in the morning about his performance review. It was not good. Then, as he was leaving his apartment, he had gotten a letter from his ex-wife's lawyer about increased child support. His back hurt from standing all day yesterday. His life hurt. That is when the thought crystallized. Today he was going to feel something other than invisible. Today he was going to remind himself and someone else that his badge meant something. Someone was going to understand what it felt like to be at the mercy of his power. All of it the supervisor's call, the lawyer's letter, the aching back. It crystallized into one clear thought. Today he was going to matter. He just did not know that his choice to matter would end him. He walked into Terminal 4, badge already secured, ready for another day of quiet resentment and careful cruelty. He had no idea what was coming. Isabella Reeves kept her head down as she moved through the security line at Terminal 4. Her grey hoodie was pulled up. Her black sweatpants were worn in all the right places to look authentically cheap rather than fashionably vintage. Her white sneakers had actually seen a college campus borrowed from a friend's closet 3 years ago. Her backpack looked like something a student would carry, not something purchased for a large amount of money at an expensive retailer. She was listening to the chaos around her, not out of paranoia, but out of necessity. Not through the earbuds in her ears, those played nothing but through everything else. She was listening to the weary parents trying to shush their children. She was listening to the impatient tapping of a businessman's Italian loafers. She was listening to the curt, barked orders of the Transportation Security Administration officers behind the checkpoint. This was her research methodology. This was how she had learned to see systems. At 29 years old, Isabella Torres was an anomaly in the business world. She was the newly minted, very secret CEO of Velocity Airlines, the primary carrier out of Terminal 4. She had gotten the job not through nepotism or legacy connections, but through a brutal, brilliant career in logistics and technology. She had redesigned the entire freight system for a global shipping company, revolutionizing how goods moved across continents. Then she had taken a tech company that was hemorrhaging money due to supply chain inefficiencies and transformed it into a profit-generating machine. The Velocity Board, desperate for a 21st century mind to save their sinking old guard airline, had hired her to reimagine what flying could be. They had offered her a corporate jet, a penthouse apartment, a driver, all the trappings of corporate success. She had declined most of it. Today was her first unofficial day as CEO. She wanted to see the airline from the bottom up. She wanted to know what the average passenger experienced. She wanted to understand the touchpoints where the system failed. She knew that corporate tours and PowerPoint presentations would lie to her. Reality never did. So she had dressed down. She had made herself invisible. She had positioned herself as someone nobody would think twice about. Someone who looked like she was just trying to get from one place to another, not someone who was about to run a multi-billion-dollar company. She had no idea she was about to get exactly what she was looking for. She had no idea that in 7 minutes she would experience the system breaking in real time. She had no idea that a man named Mark Harrison was about to make the biggest mistake of his life. She stepped forward in line, pulled off her hood slightly, and waited her turn. Next, the voice cut through the terminal din like a knife. It belonged to Officer Mark Harrison at Checkpoint Bravo. He was directing an elderly couple to step forward, and they moved with the cautious slowness of people in their 70s who did not understand the rules. Liquids in the bag, sir. Medication in the bag. How many times you want to fly today or not? His tone was not educational. It was contemptuous. The elderly man fumbled with his carry-on, confused and embarrassed. His wife put a gentle hand on his shoulder. Isabella watched Harrison for a moment. She noted the pattern. He snapped at the vulnerable. He was gentle with the confident. The businessman in the Armani suit, who had just moved through without removing his belt, got a brief nod. The woman with 2 children who apologized for being confused got a tight smile. But the elderly couple, the ones who did not move with certainty, the ones who made mistakes, they got his contempt. This was the system showing itself. This was how it actually worked underneath the appearance of fairness. She placed her backpack and shoes in a grey bin. She walked through the body scanner. Hands up and waited. Around her, other passengers moved through like water. They placed their IDs on the counter. They smiled. They were waved through. The businessman never removed his belt. Nobody said anything to him. She watched the pattern. Isabella stepped out of the scanner. That is when Mark Harrison's eyes fixed on her. It was not random, though he would later claim it was. It was not routine protocol. It was recognition. She fit a profile. Young, black, traveling alone, wearing a hoodie that made her look like she belonged to no particular world. Not professional enough for business travel, not casual enough for vacation. Just wrong somehow, just out of place. She felt the familiar tightening in her stomach, the old ugly feeling of anticipating a confrontation she did not want. You. Harrison barked not at her, but in her general direction. Over here, secondary. Of course, it was always random. She sighed internally and stepped to the side, maintaining a neutral expression. Harrison did not move toward her. He gestured with his chin to a sterile linoleum-floored area separated from the main checkpoint. Wait there. Do not touch your phone. She waited. 5 minutes passed. Her flight began boarding in 30 minutes. She watched Harrison chat with another TSA officer, Amang, about something deliberately letting her stew. This was the performance. The power lay in the waiting. This was how men like him exerted control, not through action, but through making you feel the weight of their indifference, while time slipped away. Finally, he ambled over, snapping his latex gloves with unnecessary force. All right, let's see it. Passport. Isabella unlocked her backpack, which he had gestured for with a tilt of his head, and handed him her official blue passport. He snatched it from her hand. He opened it and stared at the photo. The woman in the photo was Isabella Torres, CEO. She wore a sharp, navy blue blazer. Her natural hair was styled professionally in coils that framed her face. Her expression was one of confident, calm authority. The photograph was a declaration. "I belong everywhere." He looked from the photo to the young woman standing in front of him. Dark skin, hair pulled back into a simple bun. Grey hoodie, worn sneakers. Nothing about her suggested authority. He sneered. The disconnect was in his mind, proof of a lie. "This you?" he asked, his voice dripping with disbelief. "Yes, it is," Isabella said, her voice even and low. "Do not look like you," he said, flipping the passport dismissively. "Where you headed? Los Angeles. Business or pleasure?" The question was standard. His tone was not. It was accusatory. It was investigative. It was designed to make her defensive. "Business," she said. He laughed. An ugly short bark of a sound. "Business in that." He gestured to her sweatsuit with contempt. "You know what? This passport looks off. It was issued by the State Department 3 months ago. It is perfectly valid." Isabella said, her voice turning cold. "It is a factual statement, not an argument. Just a statement of what was true. That is what they all say," Harrison muttered, running his thumb over the edge of the laminated page. He bent it back and forth, forward and back, creating small creases, creating damage where none had existed. Isabella knew for a fact the passport was not peeling. She was watching him make it peel. "Officer, you are damaging my passport," she stated. It was not a request, it was a statement of fact. "That is federal property. Please stop." Harrison's eyes narrowed. He hated attitude. He hated it when these people, and he had a very specific image in his mind when he thought these people talked back like they were lawyers or something. "There might be a problem," he said, angling the passport under the harsh fluorescent light. "This laminate is peeling. Laminate is common sign of a counterfeit." "The laminate is not peeling," Isabella said. "You just bent it so it would." "Officer, I know my passport. I know my documentation. Is there actually a problem with it, or are we done here?" That was the moment something shifted in Mark Harrison's face. He did not like being contradicted. He did not like being challenged. He did not like a young black woman in a hoodie standing in front of him, refusing to apologize, refusing to be intimidated. "You think you are smart," he said. His voice was not loud, but it had an edge to it now. "I have been doing this for 16 years. I know what a real passport looks like, and I know what a fake one looks like. And something about yours is off. My attire is not your concern, officer," Isabella said, maintaining her composure. "Is there a problem with my documentation?" He laughed again. "That same ugly sound. You people come in here with these fake IDs thinking you can just waltz through. Where do you really get this? Did someone lend it to you? Is this someone else's passport?" "I am an American citizen," Isabella said, her voice steady. "This is my legal identification. Please hand it back to me." He held it just out of her reach, turning it over and over in his hands, like it was evidence of something. Officer Santos, the younger female officer nearby, was watching with growing discomfort. She knew this look in Mark's face. She had seen it before. "I am inspecting it," he said, his voice rising. "You do not get to tell me when I am done inspecting it." Around them, the checkpoint had quieted slightly. Not dramatically, but the usual ambient noise of travel had diminished. An elderly businessman in seat 3B looked over at the scene. A woman checking her eyeliner paused, pretending to fiddle with her phone, but actually watching what was unfolding. A mother with 2 children pulled her babies closer without looking away. Everyone sensed something was about to happen. Nobody intervened. Is there actually a specific problem? Isabella pressed. Or are you just going to keep talking? That was the trigger. Mark Harrison had been hit by a realization in that moment, that his power was being challenged, not through shouting, not through aggression, but through her refusal to be intimidated, by her knowledge of her rights, by her calm authority, by her standing there like she had every right to be. He could feel his authority slipping away. He could feel it in the way she looked at him, in the way she spoke, in the fact that she was not apologizing, was not making herself small, was not giving him the satisfaction of her fear. He leaned in, his voice dropping to something menacing and conspiratorial. You know, he said, destroying or altering a federal document is a serious offense. A federal offense, Mom. We could detain you for this. We could call the FBI. You mean you could be detained for destroying it? Isabella shot back, her fury finally breaking through. I know my rights, Officer Harrison. Get your supervisor, now! That was the word. Supervisor! It was a challenge to his authority. It was a refusal to accept his version of events. It was going over his head. It was the final insult to his fragile power. Oh, you want to see a supervisor? Harrison snarled. His hand was still gripping the passport. Fine. Let me make a call. What happened next took exactly 2 seconds. Mark Harrison hooked his thumb under the corner of the passport's data page, and the sound was quiet. It was just paper tearing, which was exactly what it was. But in the sterile silence of the secondary screening area, with at least a dozen sets of eyes suddenly locked on them, it was the loudest sound in the terminal. Officer Santos gasped and took a half-step back. Her hand flew to her mouth. An elderly businessman actually stood up from his chair. A young mother pulled her children close and whispered something in Spanish. The businessman in the Armani suit stopped dead in his tracks. A woman in row 1F gasped sharply. The tear was clean. Sharp. Intentional. Right through Isabella's photograph, right through the machine-readable code. The two halves of her identity stared up at the ceiling. Harrison tossed the ruined document onto the metal table between them like it was trash. Looks like it was fake, after all, he said, that smug, triumphant smirk spreading across his face. You are not flying anywhere today or anytime soon. Get her out of my line. Get her out of my checkpoint. He was grinning now, that predatory grin of someone who believed they had won. He had no idea the moment was already over. He had already lost. He had won. He could feel it. He had established dominance. He had put someone back in her place. He had shown everyone that his authority was absolute, unchallengeable, supreme. He had no idea that the moment his fingers released that torn passport, he had set in motion the destruction of his entire life. Isabella Reeves stared at the two pieces of her identity. She looked up at Mark Harrison. She said nothing. The absolute Arctic cold silence that emanated from her was more terrifying than any scream. He had just made the biggest mistake of his life, and he had no idea what it was going to cost him. Mom, you need to leave the secure area. Officer Santos said, her voice trembling. She was clearly horrified, but more scared of Mark than of the passenger in front of her. I am sorry. You need to go now. He destroyed my property, Isabella said quietly, her voice dangerously steady. She did not look at Santos. Her eyes were locked on Mark Harrison, who was already turning away, wiping his hands on his trousers, as if he had just handled something filthy. Officer Harrison. Isabella's voice rang out sharp as a diamond cutter. It stopped him cold. It stopped the passengers shuffling by. Everyone froze. He turned back, his face crimson with rage. He thought he had won. But she was still talking. She was still present. She was still refusing to disappear. What is your badge number? She asked. You are done here, he yelled at her. I told you the document is void. Now exit the checkpoint, or I will have Port Authority police arrest you for trespassing. I am asking for your badge number, Officer Harrison. Get her out." He yelled at Santos. "Now! Get her out!" A Port Authority officer drawn by the shouting began to approach. He was a young man, probably early 30s, and he looked confused about what exactly was happening, but understood he needed to de-escalate. Isabella knew she had lost this battle. She understood that in the next 30 seconds she would be escorted out of the secure area. She understood that getting arrested here would complicate things, would expose her identity before she was ready. She understood that this was a moment to retreat, to win the war. She carefully, deliberately picked up the 2 pieces of her ruined passport. She held them in her hand like they were made of glass. She met Mark Harrison's gaze one more time. He was still smirking. "You will regret this," she whispered. It was not a threat. It was a prophecy. Yeah. Tell it to your lawyer." He scoffed. Isabella turned and walked with all the dignity she could muster back out of the security line, moving against the flow of oncoming passengers. She endured the stares. She endured the whispers. She endured the judgment. Around her, people were filling in the blanks themselves. Troublemaker, criminal, druggie, that young black woman getting thrown out by TSA. Nobody knew the truth. Nobody understood what had just happened. They only saw what Mark Harrison had wanted them to see. She emerged back into the grand hall, which had seemed so full of promise 15 minutes before. Now it felt like a prison. She was stranded. Her flight was leaving without her. Her luggage, which she had checked earlier at the Velocity counter, was on its way to Los Angeles without her. She found a quiet corner near a closed Hudson News, sank onto a hard plastic bench, and let the first wave of pure, unadulterated fury wash over her. It was not just the inconvenience. It was the violation, the deliberate, spiteful abuse of power, the smug look on his face as he tore her identity in 2. He had not just ripped her passport. He had tried to rip her apart. He had tried to tell her she was nothing, that she had no right to travel, no right to exist in his space, that she was the problem, the outsider, the threat. She wanted to scream. She wanted to cry. She wanted to march right back up to that checkpoint and demand he restore what he had destroyed. She wanted to force him to acknowledge what he had done. But something inside her, something that had been forged through years of navigating systems as a black woman, something that had been honed through years of solving complicated problems, told her to wait, to watch, to think, to plan. The fury burned through her for exactly 60 seconds. And then something shifted. It solidified. It chilled. It compressed. It hardened into something colder and sharper. It became resolve. Isabella Reeves, future CEO of a multi-billion-dollar airline, did not become successful by being emotional. She became successful by being strategic. She pulled out her personal cell phone, not the company-issued one that tracked location and logged every call. She speed-dialed a number. It rang once. "Arthur," she said when her chief of staff picked up. Arthur listened carefully. "My day just changed, and I am about to change an entire airport." Arthur Martinez had been expecting to pick Isabella up at LaGuardia in 5 hours. He was currently in a black car heading toward Newark, talking on a Bluetooth headset, mentally preparing for what should be an uneventful afternoon picking up his new boss from a quick ground research trip. "Isabella, is everything okay?" he asked, using her actual name this time, not the internal code. He had worked with her long enough to recognize that tone in her voice. It was the tone she got when she had found something broken in a system and was about to fix it. But he already knew something was wrong. "I am still at JFK," she said, her voice flat and dangerous. "I am landside. I am not flying to Los Angeles." "What did you miss the flight? I can rebook you on the 10 o'clock flight." Arthur listened carefully. Her voice was controlled but sharp. A TSA agent just destroyed my passport. Deliberately. In front of witnesses. His name is Mark Harrison. He is at Checkpoint Bravo Terminal 4. His badge number is 7423. He confiscated my passport, accused me of carrying a counterfeit, which is absurd on its face, and when I asked for a supervisor, he ripped the data page in two. Then he had me escorted from the checkpoint. There was a dead, stunned silence on the other end of the line. "Are you okay?" Arthur finally said. "Are you hurt? Were you arrested?" "I am fine." "But he will not be. I am going to war, and I need you to move fast. I am going to give you 4 instructions, and I need you to execute them in this exact order, because timing matters." He heard the tone. It was the tone of a woman who had decided something was going to change. It was the tone of someone about to move mountains. "Tell me," Arthur said, already reaching for a notepad on his lap. "First," Isabella continued, "call the Velocity Airlines station manager at JFK. His name is Robert Henderson. Tell him the new CEO is in the Terminal 4 food court near Checkpoint Bravo and requires immediate escort to the corporate offices. Do not explain. Do not soften it. Just say urgent." "Can you do that?" "Already calling his number now. What is second legal team?" "I need the general counsel, not some junior associate. I also need the federal security director for JFK. Her name is Maria Rossi. Call her office and tell her that the CEO of her largest airline partner was just assaulted by one of her TSA officers, and I expect to meet with her in person in 90 minutes. 90 minutes, Arthur said. That is aggressive even for you. Tell her it is non-negotiable. She will understand once she realizes what this is about. Third instruction. Call the Port Authority Police Department at this terminal. I need all CCTV footage from Checkpoint Bravo Station 12 from 8:30 to 9 a.m. today. I need it preserved. I do not want it accidentally erased while they investigate. You understand what I am saying?" "They might actually do that," Arthur said quietly. "They would if given the opportunity. Which they will not have because you are making the call right now. Get on the phone. Make sure they know that Velocity Airlines is requesting preservation as a partner airline with business interest in accurate records. That gives them legal reason to comply." "Got it." "And fourth, get my legal team ready to draft charges. 18 U.S.C. Section 242. Deprivation of rights under color of law. That is federal. That means prison time, not TSA discipline, not a settlement. Prison. I want him prosecuted, not just fired." "Isabella," Arthur said carefully, "are you sure you want to go that far? I mean, he destroyed a document, he was rude, but—" "Arthur." She interrupted, her voice ice cold. "I do not want to prosecute him. I am going to prosecute him. There is a difference. He did not just damage a passport. He used his government authority to deprive me of my rights, my property, and my freedom of movement, and he did it because of my race. That is not an overstep. That is a federal crime. And I am not going to be the woman who let it slide." "Understood," Arthur said. "I am making the first call now." "Good. And Arthur. One more thing. What once you have done all 4? Do not call me back. Just watch what happens and wait for my next instruction." She hung up. Arthur sat in the back seat of his car, moving from one call to another with mechanical precision. First, Robert Henderson, who nearly dropped the phone when he heard the CEO was stranded at security. Then the Velocity legal team, already energized with the knowledge that there was a problem to solve. Then Maria Rossi's deputy, who sounded increasingly panicked as Arthur explained the situation. Finally, Port Authority police, who reluctantly agreed to preserve the footage after Arthur explained the leverage. By the time he was done, Isabella had already moved. She was in the airport bathroom looking at herself in the mirror. The girl looking back was exactly who Mark Harrison thought she was. Young, uncertain, someone to be discarded. The hoodie, the sweatpants, the worn sneakers, the invisibility costume she had worn for her ground-level research. She peeled off the hoodie slowly, pulled off the sweatpants. The bun came down and her hair fell in coils around her shoulders. She washed her hands, then washed her face. The bathroom was empty, so she took her time. Then she changed. The black cashmere travel dress went on like armor. Simple black leather flats replaced the worn sneakers. Pearl earrings went in not delicate, but declarative, definitive. The red lipstick went on last, a bold slash across her lips. Not makeup, not decoration, a statement written on her face that said, "I am here. I belong. I have power." She looked in the mirror one more time. The transformation was complete. The girl in the hoodie was gone. What remained did not just look like a CEO. What remained looked like someone about to change the world. When Isabella Torres walked out of that bathroom, the woman in the mirror was gone. What emerged was someone entirely different. Not someone pretending to be vulnerable, but someone claiming her actual power. She sat back down at the same bench, and her posture had changed entirely. Her spine was straight, her shoulders were back. Her hands moved across her laptop keyboard with confidence, not hesitation. She was no longer waiting. She was no longer researching. She was hunting. She pulled up the TSA complaint database and began searching. Mark Harrison's name came up, and what she found made her anger crystallize into something even colder. 38 complaints in 2 years. 38. She clicked through them systematically. 29 were from people of color. 12 specifically mentioned aggressive behavior and profiling. The pattern was undeniable. The organization had known about Mark Harrison. The organization had failed to stop him. She took screenshots of everything, every complaint, every pattern, every piece of evidence that proved this was not an isolated incident. Robert Henderson was having a terrible morning. The catering truck had dented the fuselage of a 737. The baggage system had malfunctioned, and he had 3 flights delayed until noon. He was a man who believed in the pecking order, and he liked being at the top of it. Being a station manager at JFK meant something. It meant authority. It meant respect. Or at least it should have meant that. His desk phone rang the direct line from corporate. He snatched it up immediately. Henderson. He said, his voice projecting the professionalism expected of his position. "Mr. Henderson, this is Arthur Martinez, Chief of Staff to the CEO. Henderson's posture straightened. He had never spoken to Arthur before. He did not even know the new CEO's name yet, just that she was some tech prodigy from the West Coast. He definitely did not know Arthur Martinez's voice. "Mr. Martinez, what can I do for corporate? You have a passenger in your terminal in the food court near Checkpoint Bravo named Isabella Reeves. She is your new CEO. She has been detained by TSA and she requires an immediate escort to your executive offices. You need to go now." Henderson almost dropped the phone. "The CEO was here. The CEO was detained, he said. "The CEO, but I thought she was arriving on the corporate jet next week." "Plans changed, Robert. Find her. Go now." The line clicked dead. Henderson's heart began hammering in his chest. The CEO was here and she was detained. This was potentially a disaster. This was the kind of situation that ended careers. His mind raced through possibilities. What could the CEO have done? Was she drunk? Belligerent? He pictured a middle-aged, sharp-suited woman having some kind of public incident. He grabbed his suit jacket and barked at his assistant to cover the desk. He practically ran out of the office, his mind racing as he headed toward the Terminal 4 food court. His mind raced with worst-case scenarios. Arrested CEO. Media circus. His career imploding before lunch. He burst into the food court, scanning the crowd. College kids. families, pilots, no one who looked like a CEO of a major airline. He was about to call Martinez back when he saw her. She was sitting alone on a bench laptop, open, typing with furious speed. She was young, very young, and black. She wore a simple black dress and looked more like a high-level marketing associate than the head of a multi-billion-dollar corporation. For a moment, Henderson hesitated. This could not be her. There had to be some mistake. But then she looked up from her laptop. Her eyes were sharp and held absolutely zero warmth. "Mr. Henderson," she said, "you are late." His blood ran cold. It was her. "Miss Reeves, I apologize," he stammered, approaching quickly. "I came as soon as I heard. I am Robert Henderson, the station manager. Please come with me. We will get you to the flagship lounge. I will get you a drink, whatever you need. We will get you rebooked on the next flight." He reached for her backpack. Isabella closed her laptop and slung the backpack over her own shoulder in one fluid motion, standing up in the same motion. "I do not want a lounge, Mr. Henderson," she said, walking past him so quickly he had to jog to keep up. "I do not want a drink. I want your largest conference room, and I want you to explain to me why your passengers are being assaulted by airport staff in your primary hub." Henderson blanched. "Assaulted Miss Reeves. I am sure TSA was just." "They were not just anything," Isabella said, walking past him toward a staff-only door. "An officer. Mark Harrison destroyed my passport. Deliberately, in front of witnesses. I am going to need your conference room, and I am going to need it right now." They moved through the staff corridor, Manager Henderson swiping his badge with trembling hands. Suddenly they were in the quiet, carpeted corridors behind the chaos of the terminal. Isabella was walking with such purpose that Henderson practically had to run to keep up. "Take me to the office, Robert, and get me the best-performing, most professional gate agent you have on duty right now. And a new phone. I need a secure company-issued line." "Yes, ma'am. Right away, ma'am. Right away." His obsequiousness was almost as offensive as Mark Harrison's aggression. Maria Rossi was in a routine TSA briefing when her deputy pulled her out. "We have a situation," Deputy Marcus said quietly. "That was Arthur Martinez from Velocity Airlines on the line. He says Officer Mark Harrison at Checkpoint Bravo destroyed a passenger's passport. The passenger was CEO Isabella Reeves of Velocity Airlines." Rossi's mind processed this information like a computer receiving corrupted data. It did not compute at the first pass. A TSA officer destroyed the CEO's passport. "Yes, ma'am. On purpose, according to Martinez. The CEO witnessed the destruction, and officers at the checkpoint confirmed Harrison deliberately damaged the document." Rossi slammed down her phone. She roared to her deputy. "Are you kidding me? A TSA agent assaulted the CEO of our largest airline partner." She understood the implications immediately. This was not some random tourist who could be silenced with a voucher and a standard apology form. This was the head of the airline that paid millions in landing fees to this airport. This was a woman who had personal connections to people in Washington. This was a situation that could trigger a federal investigation. This was code red. "Get me Supervisor David Gutierrez from Checkpoint Bravo now," Rossi ordered. "Find Officer Mark Harrison. Get his badge. Put him in a holding room. Do not let him talk to anyone. And get the head of Port Authority Police over here. We have a containment situation developing." She grabbed her blazer and moved toward the door. She had to walk into the lion's den. She had to meet with the CEO of Velocity Airlines. She had to understand what was happening before it spiraled completely out of control. This was shaping up to be the worst day of her career. Meanwhile, at checkpoint, Bravo Officer Santos was pale, typing out a report with shaking hands. Supervisor David Gutierrez ran up to her. "Where is Mark Harrison?" "He went on break, sir. He is in the cafeteria. Go get him. Tell him FSD Rossi wants to see him. Now." and tell him he is in big trouble." Officer Santos disappeared toward the cafeteria. Mark Harrison was there happily munching on a donut, bragging to two of his colleagues, Officer Peterson and Officer Marco. "So I just tore it," he was saying, laughing. Right in her stupid, arrogant face. "You will regret this." "Yeah, okay." "Regret what?" "Doing my job. That is man that was priceless." Peterson, a veteran officer with 20 years on the job, shook his head slowly. "Mark, you cannot do that. Watch me," Harrison said, taking another bite of his donut. "It was fake. She was probably a mule or something. I did this airport a favor. She is lucky I did not call the actual cops." Officer Santos appeared in the cafeteria doorway, out of breath. "Mark Harrison, Supervisor Gutierrez needs you. FSD Rossi wants to see you now. You are in big trouble." Harrison's smile faded. The half-eaten donut suddenly tasted like ash in his mouth. The FSD. Rossi never came down to the checkpoints. The FSD calling someone directly to her office meant something serious. Very serious. "What?" "For what?" he asked weakly. "That girl. Just come now." He slowly got to his feet. The cafeteria suddenly felt very cold. "What is the big deal?" he muttered as he stood up. "It is not like she is the damn Queen of England." But as he walked toward the FSD's office, something in his stomach began to churn. A cold knot of dread. The first real fear he had felt in years. He had no idea what was about to happen to him. The main conference room in the Velocity Airlines corporate suite was a glass-walled box overlooking the tarmac. 700 horsepower jets took off constantly outside the windows. It was designed to impress with its mahogany table leather chairs and the stunning view that said, "We have resources, we have power, we belong at the top of this industry." Glass walls overlooking the tarmac meant one thing: visible power. Everyone in the terminal could see who sat in this room. Everyone knew this was where decisions happened. Today it was a war room. Isabella sat at the head of the table. She had her new company-issued secure phone. Maria, the gate agent that Robert Henderson had frantically dragged from her post, was sitting nearby at a laptop, acting as her temporary assistant. She looked terrified, but was typing efficiently, pulling up documents as requested. Arthur Martinez stood behind Isabella, a grim expression on his face. He was not speaking, but his presence was significant. Chief of Staff, close advisor, the man who moved at her command. Two of Velocity's top in-house lawyers were on speakerphone listening intently. They were corporate sharks who had already begun taking notes on the conversation, anticipating what legal action might be necessary. The door opened. Robert Henderson entered, his face pale. Behind him came Maria Rossi, the Federal Security Director, wearing a sharp blue suit, but with a practiced political smile plastered on her face that did not reach her eyes. Her eyes were frantic. Rossi extended her hand across the table. "Miss Reeves, I am Maria Rossi, on behalf of the Transportation Security Administration. I cannot begin to express my profound apologies for the lapse in judgment your officer displayed this morning." Isabella did not stand. She did not shake her hand. She simply gestured to the chair opposite her. "Sit down, Director," she said. Rossi's smile faltered. She sat. "A lapse in judgment." Ms. Rossi Isabella said, her voice ice. "Is that what we are calling it?" "Well, yes, Miss Reeves. Your officer was completely out of line. Officer Mark Harrison has been pulled from the line effective immediately. He is currently facing a full investigation. I assure you he will be disciplined to the fullest extent of TSA regulations." "Disciplined," Isabella repeated, tasting the word like it was poisoned. "You mean fired?" "Well, there are union processes, I am sure you understand." "I understand." Isabella interrupted, her voice cutting through the room like a blade. that Velocity Airlines is your largest partner at this terminal. I understand that our lease renewal is next year, and I understand that right now my legal team is drawing up a lawsuit against the TSA and the Port Authority that will make your quarterly budget look like pocket change. So let us skip the process's speech and get to what I actually require." Rossi swallowed hard. The air in the room suddenly became electric with tension. "What do you want, Miss Reeves?" Rossi finally asked, dropping the political facade entirely. "First," Isabella said, leaning back in her chair, "CCTV footage from Checkpoint Bravo Station 12 from 8:30 to 9 a.m. this morning. My team already requested it. It is on its way." "Yes, my team is pulling it now," Rossi confirmed, though she knew the footage would likely be grainy and definitely would not have audio. "Second," Isabella continued, "I want Officer Mark Harrison here in this room. Right now. I want to look the man who assaulted me in the eye." Rossi's eyes widened. "Here, Miss Reeves, I am not sure that is appropriate. We do not typically." "I am not asking if it is appropriate," Isabella said, her voice dropping to something that was somehow more threatening than if she had yelled. "I am telling you what I require. I want to look at him. I want him to understand what he has done. Or—" She leaned forward and her voice became diamond hard. "We can end this meeting, and my next call will be to the Secretary of Homeland Security. I believe I have her personal cell number from my time on the President's Tech Advisory Board. Your call." Rossi's face went pale. She was a political appointee who understood leverage when she felt it. She understood that Isabella was not bluffing. She understood that the call to the secretary was a real possibility. "Get him," Rossi said to her deputy Marcus, who was waiting outside the door. "Bring Harrison and his supervisor. Now." While they waited, the room filled with suffocating silence. Robert Henderson looked like he was about to be physically ill. Arthur was quietly taking notes on a legal pad. Isabella simply stared out the window at her airline's planes, her expression completely unreadable. The waiting was its own kind of power play. Finally, the door opened again. Supervisor David Gutierrez entered first, looking absolutely terrified. He was followed by Officer Mark Harrison. Harrison was no longer the strutting, arrogant tyrant of the checkpoint. His face was blotchy and slick with sweat. He had clearly been told who he was about to meet. He understood on some level that something had shifted. When he saw Isabella sitting at the head of the table, dressed in her elegant black dress, looking every bit the titan of industry she was, his knees visibly buckled. He looked from her to his boss, FSD Rossi, whose expression was murderous. The look on her face was not the look of someone who was angry about racism or civil rights. It was the look of someone who was angry about getting caught, about her reputation being damaged, about her career being threatened. It was the look of someone whose political calculations had gone sideways. "Officer Harrison," Isabella said, her voice soft. It was more terrifying than if she had yelled. "Ma'am," he whispered, his voice hoarse. He could not look at her directly. His eyes darted between her face and the floor. "Please come closer," she said. "Stand at the end of the table." He shuffled forward like a condemned man walking his last mile. Every step felt heavier than the last. Every breath came harder. Around him, the conference room had become oppressively quiet. He could hear the hum of the air conditioning. He could hear the distant sound of an aircraft taking off outside. He could hear his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. "This morning," Isabella said, "you looked at me, and you saw what exactly a threat, a nobody, someone you could hurt without consequences. I was following procedure." He stammered, his eyes darting to Rossi for help. He got none. "I was just— the passport, it looked. The passport was fine until you started bending it," Isabella said. She stood up and began walking around the table. "Let us skip that part. Let us skip to the part where you accused me of being aggressive, where you ripped up my documentation, where you treated me like I was less than human. You were non-compliant. He tried his voice cracking. You were argumentative. Was I? Isabella smiled. It was a cold, sharp expression that made him flinch. Or did you just encounter someone who knew their rights and refused to be intimidated by your uniform? She nodded to Arthur, who picked up a small, sleek digital audio recorder from the table. He pressed play. The entire horrifying exchange filled the silent boardroom. "This you came," Harrison's voice. "Yes, it is," came Isabella's voice. "Do not look like you. That is my passport officer. Business in that mocking tone. My attire is not your concern, officer. Is there a problem with my documentation?" "There might be. This laminate is peeling. Common sign of a counterfeit." "Officer, you are damaging my passport. That is federal property. Please stop." "I am inspecting it. You people come in here with these fake IDs. I know my rights. Get your supervisor." "Oh, you want to see a supervisor?" "Fine." Then the sound unmistakable and undeniable. The sharp tear of a passport page being torn, followed by Harrison's voice full of smug triumph. "Looks like it was fake after all. You are not flying anywhere today or any time soon. Get out of my line." Arthur pressed stop. The silence in the room was absolute, suffocating, complete. Mark Harrison made a small, choking sound in his throat. Robert Henderson shut his eyes and turned away. Maria Rossi stared at the recorder as if it might bite her. Her political mask had completely crumbled. What remained was the raw face of someone whose career was imploding in real time. Isabella leaned back in her chair. "That is interesting, is not it, Director?" "Because I remember it very differently than your officer clearly intended it. I remember being calm, polite, asking for my rights to be respected. What I hear in that recording is a man who was threatened by the fact that I was not afraid of him." She stood up and walked around the table until she was standing directly in front of Mark Harrison. "You are fired, Mr. Harrison. That is the first thing. Effective immediately. No suspension, no retraining period. You are fired." "Yes, ma'am," Rossi said quickly, nodding. "Consider it done." "No," Isabella said, holding up a hand. "You do not get to fire him. He is a federal employee. What you get to do is start the termination procedures." "But I am not stopping there." She turned back to face Mark. Her voice when she spoke was controlled but powerful. "My legal team, the ones on that speakerphone, will be handing this audio recording along with a sworn affidavit from me to the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Eastern District of New York. Officer Harrison, I am not just having you fired. I am having you prosecuted." She paused, letting that sink in. 18 U.S.C. Section 242, Deprivation of Rights under Color of Law. You used your government authority to deprive me of my rights, my property, and my freedom of movement based on my race and appearance. That is not a regulatory violation. That is a federal crime. That carries prison time. Mark's eyes widened. They were the eyes of a man watching his world collapse in real time. "Please, please," he whispered. His voice broke. I have a family, a mortgage. I was having a bad day." Isabella's voice rose for the first time, not in anger, but in something colder, something more powerful, something that cracked through the room like a whip. "A bad day. Officer Harrison, do you know how many bad days people who look like me have to endure at the hands of men like you? Do you know how many times I have been questioned, searched, accused, humiliated simply because of my appearance?" She stepped closer to him. "You did not just ruin my flight, Officer Harrison. You tried to ruin my identity. You thought I was nobody. You thought I was garbage you could throw away. You looked at me and you thought, I can get away with this. She paused, and the silence was deafening. "You were right about one thing. You would have gotten away with it, because that is how systems work. Officers like you operate for years, accumulating complaints, hurting people, and nobody stops you because the organization protects you. But do you know why that stops today?" She stepped even closer. "Because I understand something that you do not. This is not about my career. This is not about Velocity Airlines having leverage. This is about making sure that a 16-year pattern of harassment does not get swept under a rug with a settlement and an apology. This is about consequences being real, about people understanding that when you abuse power, there are actual permanent life-altering consequences." She stepped back. "Your life is not over, Officer Harrison. You just have to build a new one where you do not have a badge to hide behind, one where the authority you have been using as a weapon is gone, one where you are going to have to understand what it feels like to be vulnerable, just like you made me vulnerable, just like you made thousands of other people vulnerable." She looked at Supervisor Gutierrez and FSD Rossi. "Get him out of my boardroom." Two Port Authority officers called by Rossi's deputy entered the room. They gently but firmly lifted Mark Harrison by his elbows. He was still sobbing, not with dignity or remorse, but with the terrified, hiccuping sobs of a bully who had just realized the consequences were real and permanent. "I need his badge and his credentials," Rossi ordered, her voice sharp. "Now." Still sobbing, Mark fumbled with the clip on his belt. His hands were shaking so badly he could barely manage it. He handed his badge and his government ID to Supervisor Gutierrez, who took them as if they were contaminated. "Please," Mark whispered one last time, looking at Isabella. "Please, I am begging you. I am begging you too." Isabella just stared at him. Her expression was as unyielding as the granite foundation of the building. She had seen men like him before, men who were lions when they had power and whimpering cowards when they faced real consequences. She felt nothing for him, no pity, no sympathy, only the cold satisfaction of justice being served. The officers led him out of the room. The door clicked shut, leaving behind an echoing, heavy silence. Supervisor David Gutierrez was visibly shaking. Tears filled his eyes. "Miss Reeves," he said, his voice trembling. I am so sorry. I did not see it. He has always been a hard case, but I did not know this was happening." Isabella's demeanor softened, but only slightly. Her voice was measured, professional, and absolutely clear. "You are his supervisor, Mr. Gutierrez. Your job is to know. You let a predator work your checkpoint. You failed." I understand, Miss Reeves. I am so. However," Isabella continued, holding up a hand, "you did not commit the act. You are a witness, not to what happened today, but to what has been happening for 16 years. You can be a witness for Officer Harrison, or a witness for me, and for every other passenger he has profiled and harassed. When the U.S. Attorney calls you, I suggest you make the right choice." Gutierrez nodded, tears streaming down his face. "Yes, ma'am. Of course. Anything you need." "You can go," Isabella said. Gutierrez fled the room. His composure completely shattered. Now only Mariah Rossi and Robert Henderson remained in the room with Isabella and her Chief of Staff Arthur. "Well," Isabella said, sitting back down at the head of the table. "That was unpleasant, but necessary." Mariah Rossi looked exhausted. She had just seen one of her own officers effectively arrested. She understood that the political shrapnel from this moment was going to hit her desk for months, if not years. "Miss Reeves," Rossi said carefully. "Again, my apologies. My legal team will work with the State Department's Diplomatic Passport Office to have your document replaced immediately. We have an on-site liaison. We can have a new valid passport in your hands within 2 hours. Thank you," Isabella said. I will need that. But do not for 1 second think this is over. We are not done, Director. Not even close. Rossi frowned. She had just surrendered to every major demand. She had sacrificed one of her officers. She had absorbed the immediate crisis. What more could the woman possibly want? I am not sure I follow. Rossi said carefully. The officer has been terminated, Isabella said. He is being prosecuted. The document is being replaced. But that is reactive, Director. You fixed my problem. You have not fixed the problem. The problem is not Mark Harrison. The problem is the culture that created him. She turned her laptop so Rossi could see the screen. It showed the TSA complaint database for the JFK division. Officer Mark Harrison has 38 complaints filed against him in the last 2 years. 38. 29 of those are from people of color. 12 specifically mention aggressive behavior and profiling. He is not a bad apple director. He is a rotten core, and your organization let him fester for a decade and a half. Rossi stared at the screen. She knew Harrison was a problem. But seeing the data laid out like that, seeing the racial breakdown, seeing the pattern so clearly visible, it was damning. I want a full audit, Isabella said. Independent third-party review of every single profiling complaint from the last 3 years. All of them. And Velocity Airlines will pay for it. So you cannot claim budget constraints. An independent audit, Rossi whispered. That would be a bureaucratic nightmare. It would expose exactly how bad things had gotten under her leadership. And, Isabella continued, her voice steady and relentless, Velocity will also be funding a new mandatory quarterly training program for your entire JFK staff focused on de-escalation and treating all passengers with dignity. Not the 1-hour PowerPoint you currently use, a real program taught by experts in racial psychology and de-escalation techniques. My team will select the firm. This is unprecedented, Rossi said weakly. A private company overseeing federal employee training. It is non-negotiable, Isabella said. You have a choice. You can agree to this, and we work together to fix the culture at JFK. Or we can go to court. We can make this public in ways that will make your career here very, very difficult. We can ensure that every news outlet in the country covers not just what happened to me, but the pattern of what has happened to everyone else. She leaned forward. Or you can see this as an opportunity to be the federal security director who actually did something about unfair treatment at her airport, whose leadership transformed a broken culture into something better, whose name becomes synonymous with real change. Rossi sat silently for a long moment. She was calculating, weighing options, understanding that she had no real leverage and very few good choices. We can discuss the logistics, she finally said weakly. It was a surrender. Good, Isabella said. My Chief of Staff Arthur will be in touch to discuss specifics. You should consider this a new binding term of our partnership at this airport. Rossi, defeated, nodded. Understood. If you will excuse me, I need to go manage the fallout. She stood up her suit jacket, suddenly looking too big for her, and walked out of the room like a woman moving through water. Now only Robert Henderson remained sitting silently in the corner like a ghost. Isabella turned her chair to face him directly. Robert, she said, her voice now calm, almost conversational. We need to talk about you. Henderson's head snapped up. Miss Reeves, do you know what my biggest problem is right now, Robert? It is not Mark Harrison. He is just a man with a uniform who does not understand limits. It is not Maria Rossi. She is just a bureaucrat who did not know her own organization was broken. My biggest problem is you. Isabella stood up and walked to the glass wall overlooking the tarmac. She looked down at Velocity's baggage handlers loading a plane at the workers moving through the terminal like ants in a colony. I was stranded, Robert, humiliated, a passenger of your airline in your terminal. And where were you? Where was your team? Did a single Velocity gate agent step in? Did a single customer service representative see that confrontation and think, that is our passenger? That is our responsibility. Let us help Miss Reeves. We usually do not interfere with TSA. Do not give me that excuse, she said, spinning to face him. You did not know I was your CEO. You just saw a passenger, a young black woman in a hoodie, and your entire system is designed to ignore that person. You are so busy managing catering trucks and baggage belts that you have forgotten what we are actually selling. She pointed at him. We are not selling seats, Robert. We are not selling routes. We are selling service. We are selling dignity. We are selling the promise that when a customer steps into our terminal, they will be treated like they matter. And when that customer is deprived of their rights, your job is to step in. Robert Henderson had no response. He knew she was right. The only reason you came to get me is because my chief of staff called from a corporate office. You did not come to help a passenger, Robert. You came to save your job. That is a failure of leadership. That is a failure of culture. That is your failure. Isabella walked back to the head of the table and sat down. I am not flying to Los Angeles today. I am staying here for a week. I am going to be in your break rooms. I am going to be at your gates. I am going to be in your baggage claim area. My review of this airline did not start in the boardroom. It started in that security line when I was treated like I did not matter. She paused, letting her words sink in. And Robert, you are starting with a very, very low score. I suggest you decide right now if you are going to fix it or if you are going to start looking for a new job. Henderson nodded, his face pale. Yes, ma'am. I understand, Miss Reeves. I will work to fix it. I promise you I will fix it. You better, Isabella said. Now send in Mariah. I need to rebook my flight. And Robert, get me a coffee. Black. And find my luggage. We are wasting daylight. The news of the incident at Checkpoint Bravo spread through the executive levels of JFK with the speed of a wildfire in dry brush. Within 3 hours, every airline manager, every port authority executive, and every high-level TSA official knew that an agent had been frog-marched out of the terminal for assaulting the new CEO of Velocity Airlines. Within 5 hours, Mark Harrison's face was being discussed in break rooms and administrative offices across the airport. By evening, his picture was on a news report about TSA misconduct, pixelated to protect his privacy, but clearly identifiable to anyone who worked with him. Mark was processed not by his friends, but by Port Authority police who were taking their cues from a furious Maria Rossi. He was charged by Port Authority police with destruction of property that was just the appetizer course. By 4 o'clock that day, the U.S. Attorney's Office had received the audio file and a sworn affidavit from Isabella Torres. The case was assigned to an ambitious assistant U.S. attorney named Rebecca Chen, who saw exactly what it was: a high-profile civil rights case, a slam-dunk prosecution. By the next morning, a federal warrant had been issued. Mark Harrison was at home trying to explain to his wife why his paycheck had been stopped when 2 FBI agents knocked on his door. They arrested him for 18 U.S.C. Section 242 deprivation of rights under color of law. The charge was no longer a theory discussed in a boardroom. It was reality on a rap sheet. It was federal. It meant prison. His case was fast-tracked. The audio recording was undeniable. His own colleague, Officer Santos, testified against him, stating she had seen him deliberately bend and then rip the passport in an act of deliberate malice. She testified about the threat he had whispered to Isabella afterward. She testified about patterns she had witnessed over the years. She was terrified, but she told the truth. Mark's defense attorney begged him to take a plea deal to avoid a longer sentence. Mark Harrison pleaded guilty. He had no other choice. The evidence was too clear. His own voice on that recording was too damning. There was no defense. There was no explanation that would work. The judge who sentenced him was a no-nonsense woman named Margaret Holbrook, who had heard too many "I was having a bad day" excuses to be impressed by his tears. She had sentenced dozens of police officers for civil rights violations. She knew what they sounded like. She knew what they looked like. She knew what they tried to say. She gave him 18 months in federal minimum security prison. He lost his job, which was already gone. He lost his pension, which meant his retirement evaporated. He lost the right to ever carry a firearm again, meaning any future job in law enforcement was impossible. He had a criminal record that would follow him for the rest of his life. He had time to serve. He had consequences to face. His wife did not even show up to the sentencing. She had already filed for divorce and moved to Connecticut with a new boyfriend. His ex-wife took him to court for increased child support retroactive to the date of his arrest. He owed $15,000 before he even went to prison. When Mark's lawyer explained that he would lose his pension, Mark just nodded. What was one more thing? His entire identity had already been stripped away. Prison, he realized, would actually be easier than this. At least in prison, everyone knew where they stood. There were no surprises. There was no hope. And somehow that was a relief. When Mark went to federal minimum security prison in West Virginia, he was assigned to work in the kitchen preparing food for other inmates. He had 18 months of time to serve. 18 months of thinking about what he had done. 18 months of sitting with the weight of his choices. The first few months were the hardest. He kept replaying that moment at the checkpoint, that moment when he had ripped the passport. He understood with excruciating clarity that he had had a choice. He could have checked her documentation carefully. He could have been professional. He could have treated her with dignity. Instead, he had chosen to humiliate her. He had chosen to use his badge as a weapon. He had chosen to believe that his position protected him. By month 6, something shifted. The anger that had sustained him began to crack. He started talking to other inmates who had done time for federal crimes. He listened to their stories. He began to understand, really understand what he had done to Isabella Torres. Not as an intellectual exercise, but emotionally, viscerally. He had tried to diminish someone's humanity, and it had cost him everything. By month 12, Mark Harrison started keeping a journal. Not because anyone asked him to, but because he needed to understand what he had done. He had spent 16 years making people feel powerless. Isabella Torres had spent 16 hours making him understand exactly what that felt like. The journal entries grew longer, the understanding deeper. By month 18, when he was eligible for work release, he could finally write one sentence that captured everything. "I see now. I finally see." His wife had already left. She had gone to her sister's in Connecticut with the kids 2 weeks before his sentencing. She had filed for divorce while he was waiting trial. She was not interested in standing by him through this. Mark Harrison, at 48 years old, with a federal conviction, looked at the rest of his life and saw nothing but empty years stretching ahead. But Isabella Reeves barely thought about him anymore. He was a footnote in a much larger story, the story of a woman who refused to accept injustice as the normal price of existing while black in America. He was the catalyst, but he was not the main event. The main event was the change that came next. 6 weeks after Mark Harrison was arrested, an independent firm specializing in workplace discrimination was brought into the TSA division at JFK. They came equipped with data analysts, behavioral scientists, and a mandate from the top. Expose everything. They reviewed every complaint filed in the last 3 years, every single one. They examined every interaction logged in the system. They reviewed camera recordings with audio. They conducted interviews with passengers who had filed complaints. They interviewed TSA officers about the culture at the checkpoint. What they found was not a handful of bad apples. It was an orchard that had been rotting from the root. Officer Samuel Reeves had been stopping black travelers at twice the rate of white travelers for 6 straight years. The data was clear, undeniable. When confronted with the numbers during the investigation, he simply shrugged and said, "Intuition." The audit had another word for it: racial discrimination. Officer Reeves was terminated. Officer Jennifer Walsh had been hostile to elderly passengers and immigrants throughout her tenure. She had made aggressive comments to Spanish-speaking travelers and had been reported multiple times for treating elderly passengers rudely. Her complaint file contained 7 documented incidents over 4 years, each one labeled informal in the system, so it would not trigger official investigation protocols. She was given the choice: resign or face federal charges. She resigned. Officer Carlos Mendez had a pattern of aggressive behavior toward women traveling alone. Multiple passengers reported inappropriate comments and invasive screening procedures. 5 complaints from women who had felt genuinely harassed and threatened. He was fired for cause. His appeal was denied. Supervisor David Gutierrez, who had been Mark Harrison's boss and friend, had known about the complaints against Harrison. He had seen the patterns himself. He had received reports from other officers about Harrison's behavior, and he had done nothing because confronting it would have meant confronting the culture he had participated in creating. He was forced into early retirement with a reduced pension, a bureaucratic mercy for someone who had allowed a predator to operate unchecked. FSD Maria Rossi was reassigned to a desk job in Washington, D.C., a classic bureaucratic execution where powerful incompetence goes to slowly die while still collecting a government salary. Her career trajectory stopped dead. She would spend the rest of her working life in a position where nobody reported to her and her decisions did not matter. She had gone from running a major airport security division to pushing papers in a basement office. The audit was a bloodbath, but a necessary one. The investigation uncovered patterns across the entire division. 47 TSA officers with verifiable patterns of harassment and bias. 12 received formal warnings. 7 were fired outright. 3 others were forced into early retirement. Most damning was the racial breakdown of stops, aggressive encounters, and repeat interactions with the same passengers. The data did not lie. It could not be negotiated with or explained away. The numbers were what they were. Once the audit findings became public, something unexpected happened. Other TSA agents began coming forward. Agents who had been uncomfortable with how things worked at the checkpoint. Agents who had seen misconduct and stayed silent because the system had incentivized silence. They provided testimony. They provided evidence. They provided the names of people who had been harmed. Young officers talked about being bullied by senior officers like Mark Harrison into complying with his methods. Officers talked about witnessing discrimination and knowing it was wrong, but fearing retaliation if they spoke up. Longtime officers discussed how discrimination had become normalized, how it had become just how things worked at the checkpoint. The system was not just broken in one place, it was broken throughout. The investigation report was over 200 pages. It contained detailed analysis of discrimination patterns. It contained recommendations for cultural change. It contained recommendations for new training protocols, new supervision structures, and new accountability mechanisms. None of it would have been possible without Isabella's lawsuit threat and her demands for change. Major newspapers picked up the story. The Washington Post ran TSA reckoning hidden patterns of racial discrimination at major airport. The New York Times published how one CEO exposed institutional abuse at TSA. News organizations that had been running the standard TSA searches passenger stories suddenly had a bigger narrative. The story of institutional racism hiding in plain sight. The story went viral because it was real, because it was documented, because it showed not just one bad officer, but evidence of a broken culture that needed to be reformed from the ground up. And then passengers began coming forward with their own stories. A woman who spoke Spanish described the extra screening she had endured every single time she flew. She had kept detailed records of dates and times. A man of South Asian descent talked about the fear he felt every time he approached a checkpoint, the assumption that he was a threat. A black man discussed the time a TSA officer had questioned whether his pilot credentials were authentic, as if his uniform and documentation were not proof enough. These stories were not abstract anymore. They were not hypothetical. They were real experiences from real people whose dignity had been violated by people wearing government uniforms. And they validated what Isabella had already understood. This was not about one bad person. This was about a culture that had allowed bad people to flourish. The program that Velocity Airlines and the TSA created together became known as the Washington Initiative, named after Isabella, though she had requested her name not be used. The board insisted. She eventually relented. It was not a one-hour PowerPoint about unconscious bias. It was not a compliance training that TSA officers could sleep through or ignore. It was a genuine program of transformation that ran for 4 weeks for every officer in the JFK division. Week 1 was called Self-Awareness and Mirror. Officers watched videos of their own body camera footage. They watched themselves making assumptions in real time about passengers. They watched themselves accelerating conflict instead of de-escalating it. They watched themselves treating different people differently and often did not even realize they were doing it. The mirror was undeniable. You cannot argue with your own voice on a recording. You cannot deny your own behavior when you are watching yourself on screen, can you? One officer, a man named Peterson with 18 years on the job, broke down in tears watching himself demand extra screening from an elderly woman for no reason other than her accent. He had never understood before, seeing it on video, how his own prejudice had shaped his work. Seeing himself hearing his own voice made it impossible to deny. Week 2 was Understanding the Brain, How Bias Works. Psychologists came in and explained scientifically how bias operates in human brains. Not moralistically preaching about good and evil, but actual neuroscience. How pattern recognition gets hijacked by fear. How stress amplifies bias. How power corrupts decision-making. How trauma and previous experiences shape how we interpret new situations. Officers were not monsters, the psychologists explained. They were humans with flawed brains operating in high-stress environments. But, and this was the critical, but that does not excuse behavior. It explains it. Understanding does not mean accepting. One psychologist said, "Your brain is making assumptions. That is not evil. That is human. But your job is to slow down enough to question those assumptions. Your job is to see the passenger as a person, not as a profile. Can you do that? Are you willing to do that?" Most officers said yes. Some said no, and left the program. Those who left were not cut out for this work anyway. Week 3 was Witness Testimony Face-to-Face. TSA officers who had been discriminated against sat face-to-face with their colleagues who had treated them poorly. A black pilot talked about the time another TSA agent had asked if he had the right to be in the cockpit. His pilot uniform was not proof enough, apparently. The officer listening had never considered what it felt like to have your credentials questioned because of how you looked. A Latina woman described being interrogated for 45 minutes over a valid passport because her accent made an officer suspicious. She talked about the shame, the embarrassment, the way her young daughter had watched her being treated like a criminal. The officer listening broke down. He recognized himself in that story. He had done similar things. A South Asian man talked about the routine humiliation of extra screening every single time he flew the assumption that he was automatically a threat because of how he looked. 20 years of travel, 20 years of being profiled, 20 years of teaching his children that their appearance made them suspect. One officer, a young woman named Jennifer, actually fainted during one testimony, not from weakness but from recognition. She had done what was described. She had treated someone that way. And only in that moment, seeing the victim's face, did she understand what she had done. These were not abstract discussions. These were real people with real trauma sharing with officers who had caused that trauma. The officers could not hide from it. They could not deny it. They had to sit with the knowledge that they had caused this pain, that their actions, their assumptions, their prejudices had created fear in other human beings. Week 4 was de-escalation and practical application. Officers learned to recognize when they were making assumptions, learned to slow down instead of rushing to judgment, learned practical techniques for treating every passenger as a person with inherent dignity. They practiced scenarios. They role-played difficult interactions. They learned language that de-escalated instead of escalated. They learned when to say, "I do not know enough information to make this call. Let me get a supervisor to help me think through this." They learned that admitting uncertainty was not weakness. It was wisdom. One officer stood up in the final session and said, "I came into this program angry. I came in thinking this was political correctness run wild. But something changed. I realized that I was tired of being angry all the time. I was tired of seeing threats everywhere. I was tired of treating people like criminals when they had done nothing wrong. This program gave me permission to be different. The results were measurable and real. Passenger complaints dropped 60% in the first 6 months. By the end of the first year, they had dropped 78%. Most significantly, discrimination complaints from passengers of color dropped 85%. People felt safer. People felt respected. But something unexpected happened. Officer job satisfaction went up. Not down. Up. 30% higher in the first 6 months alone. Officers reported less stress, less conflict with passengers. They felt like ambassadors instead of antagonists. They had better working relationships with their colleagues. Why? Because when you treat people with dignity, they treat you with dignity. When you de-escalate, passengers relax. When you are not looking for threat, you see less threat. It becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, but the positive version instead of the negative one. The program expanded to other airports. The FBI used it as a training model for their agents. State police departments implemented it. It became a blueprint for law enforcement de-escalation training nationally. What started as Isabella's demand for accountability became an industry standard. 6 months into the program, the first cohort of officers graduated. There was a small ceremony at JFK. Not a celebration of good job, not being racist. Nobody was pretending that was something to celebrate. But recognition of genuine change, real commitment to a different approach to their work. Some officers cried. One said, "I did not know I could do my job this way. It is better. For me, for passengers, for everyone." The culture began to shift generationally. New officers who came after this point were trained differently from their first day. They did not learn the old patterns. They learned professionalism. They learned restraint. They learned dignity. In the long term, that was the real victory. Not just the immediate consequences for Mark Harrison, though those were real, but the cultural transformation that would prevent future Mark Harrisons from ever operating unchecked again. 6 months after the incident, Isabella Reeves stood in the exact same spot in Terminal 4 where she had been treated like a criminal. Checkpoint Bravo, the secondary screening area, the exact place where her dignity had been violated and her passport had been destroyed. She stood for exactly 30 seconds at Checkpoint Bravo remembering. The spot where she had stood being humiliated. The spot where she had learned that consequences could change the world. The checkpoint was different. It was brighter for one thing. They had upgraded the lighting with new LED systems. The lines were shorter thanks to the new logistical flow that Isabella herself had designed when she had spent that week working at every level of the terminal. New automated bag drop machines lined the walls, cutting down the traditional check-in lines by 40%. Signage was in multiple languages: English, Spanish, Mandarin, Arabic. The officers themselves seemed different. Less militant, more professional, less like they were looking for an excuse to exert power, and more like they were trying to help people move through the system efficiently and respectfully. Isabella wore a tailored linen suit. Not disguise anymore. Confidence unmistakable. Everyone in Terminal 4 knew who she was. Her presence had become almost mythical in the airline world, the CEO who did not just fire a rogue officer, but transformed an entire culture. Robert Henderson met her at the entrance to the checkpoint. He looked different from 6 months ago. Thinner, more tired, but also more genuine. He had taken her criticisms to heart and genuinely tried to reform his station. The data proved it. Passenger satisfaction up 35%. Customer service complaints down 40%. Velocity employees at JFK expressing higher job satisfaction than any other Velocity hub. His suit fit better. His voice was clearer. But there was something else, a weight in his shoulders that had not been there before. The weight of someone doing their job right. "Miss Reeves, welcome back," he said, extending his hand. She shook it briefly professionally. "Robert, how are the quarter numbers? Complaints down 40% as I mentioned. On-time performance up 12%. Employee satisfaction metrics improving steadily. We are implementing your suggestions about customer service protocols." He paused. "We are actually doing this. This is not just talk anymore. You are actually changing," Isabella said. There was genuine surprise in her voice. "You actually took the criticism seriously." He nodded. "You were right. We forgot who we were serving." Isabella stepped up to Checkpoint Bravo, the same one where Mark Harrison had worked. A new young officer was stationed there, could not have been more than 25. She had been trained in the new program. She smiled when she saw Isabella approaching. A genuine smile, not performing, not trying to project power, just professional warmth and competence. "Good morning, Miss Torres." "Flying to Los Angeles today?" the officer asked, using her actual name. "I am," Isabella said. "Can I see your boarding pass and passport, please?" She handed them over. The officer scanned them efficiently, professionally, with genuine care. "Everything looks perfect. Have a wonderful flight," the officer said, handing them back with a warm smile. It was so normal, so respectful, so profoundly, remarkably ordinary. Isabella collected her bag and walked toward the Velocity Airlines first-class lounge. As she passed through the terminal, she noticed a young black girl traveling with her mother, maybe 12 years old. The girl was not nervous, was not making herself small, was not gripping her mother's hand in fear. She was just traveling, like she belonged, like she deserved to be there, like she expected to be treated with dignity. That young girl would never know a woman named Isabella Torres had fought for her right to fly without fear. She would never understand the legal battles, the audit, the policy changes, but she would feel it. She would inherit a world where her skin color did not make airport staff suspicious. That was Isabella's real victory, not justice for herself, but dignity for someone who would never know her name. That sight hit Isabella harder than she expected. In the first-class lounge, she saw Velocity staff moving differently. They were not just serving. They were serving with genuine care, presence, attention. The entire culture had shifted. She boarded the flight. As she settled into seat 7A, she looked out of the window at the concrete and planes and workers moving through the terminal below. She had come to this airport as a customer and had been treated like a criminal. She was leaving it as someone who had transformed it. Not through anger, though she had had plenty of that. Not through destruction, though she had destroyed Mark Harrison's career and probably should feel something about that, but mostly she just felt that he had made his own choices and faced real consequences. But through strategic thinking, through understanding how systems actually work, through refusing to let what happened to her happen to anyone else, she did not think about Mark Harrison often anymore. He was in federal prison, working in the kitchen, his pension gone, his credibility destroyed, his freedom limited. But she had realized something over these months. His personal suffering was not actually the point. The point was that the culture had changed. The point was that another young woman would not have to experience what she experienced. The point was that, young girl in the terminal, she would fly with dignity, because Isabella had refused to accept being humiliated. That was the real victory. That was what kept her going when the legal fights got exhausting. That was what made all of it worth it. 1 year after the incident at Checkpoint Bravo, Isabella Reeves was invited to deliver the keynote address at the National Aviation and Transport Summit in Washington, D.C. The ballroom at the Grand Hyatt was filled with every CEO of every major American airline. The Secretary of Homeland Security sat in the front row. The new head of the TSA, not Maria Rossi, who had been quietly reassigned to that basement office, was present. Senators and representatives filled the audience. Media was everywhere. Isabella took the stage without a podium, without notes. She owned the room simply through her presence. "We are in a unique position today." She began, her voice clear and strong, carrying through the massive ballroom. "To make a choice about what we value in this industry. We can value efficiency and cost-cutting and security theater, or we can value people. When we give someone a badge," she continued, "we are not giving them power. We are entrusting them with responsibility. The power to protect, yes, but also the power to humiliate, the power to respect, or the power to profile. For too long we have asked only one question. What is in the bag? What is in the pocket? We have asked everything except the most important question. How do we speak to a human being? How do we see the person in front of us as deserving of dignity?" She paced the stage slowly. 1 year ago, an officer at JFK Airport made a choice. He chose to abuse his authority. He profiled a passenger. He destroyed her document. He did this believing he would never face consequences. He was wrong. But he was not acting alone. He was acting within a culture that had trained him, a culture that had protected him, a culture that had rewarded his behavior with the knowledge that he could act with impunity. She paused. "So we did not just prosecute one man. We changed that culture. We implemented new training. We implemented new accountability. We made one thing very clear. Discrimination is not a professional hazard. It is a federal crime. It carries real consequences, permanent consequences, life-altering consequences." Isabella then announced something historic: the National Passenger Charter of Rights, a coordinated commitment from Velocity Airlines, American Airlines, Delta Airlines, Southwest United, and JetBlue. "Every passenger," she said, "has the right to be treated with baseline human dignity regardless of appearance, race, religion, or national origin. Every passenger has the right to have grievances heard by an independent ombudsman, not an internal review board. Every passenger has the right to be informed of their rights before secondary screening in their preferred language. Every passenger has the right to know that all interactions with security personnel are recorded for their protection and for transparency." She paused for emphasis. "And most importantly, every passenger has the right to know that if they are discriminated against, they will be treated as a federal civil rights violation, not as an operational inconvenience, not as a training opportunity, as a crime." The room was absolutely silent. People were actually moved. "The training program we implemented at JFK reduced discrimination complaints by 85% in the first year." She continued. "Officer job satisfaction increased 30%. Not because we were softer on crime, but because we were more honest about what we were doing." We showed officers that treating people with dignity actually makes their jobs easier. That de-escalation works. That seeing passengers as human beings creates better outcomes for everyone. She walked to the edge of the stage, and for a moment her voice became more personal. A year ago, a girl in a hoodie was humiliated by someone in a uniform. That girl was me. And if my consequences can prevent the next me from experiencing what I experienced, then everything is worth it. A year later, I stood in that same checkpoint and watched a young black girl walk through with her mother completely at ease, completely confident that she would be treated with respect. She looked directly at the audience. That difference, that is what we changed. That is what real justice looks like. Not just one man's downfall, not just a lawsuit or a settlement, but a culture transformed. A generation of children who will not have to internalize the message that their appearance makes them suspect. She continued, her voice gaining power. You never know who you are talking to. That customer you decide to profile might be the CEO of your largest airline. That teenager you decide to humiliate might be a future senator. But more importantly, that person deserves dignity not because of who they are, because they are human. Period. She walked back across the stage. The officer involved in this incident is in federal prison. He lost everything. But I do not want you to hear a story about one man's downfall. I want you to hear the story about how a culture changed, how one woman's humiliation became an entire industry's reckoning, because that is the real victory. That is what actually matters. She walked to the edge of the stage, and her voice dropped. I kept the 2 pieces of my destroyed passport on my desk, not as a trophy, as a reminder of what happens when someone decides they will not accept injustice as normal. They change everything. The room erupted in a standing ovation. It was steady, genuine. People actually moved by what they had just heard. As Isabella walked off stage, the Secretary of Homeland Security grabbed her hand. "Miss Torres," he said, "you have changed the conversation for this entire country. You turned a violation into a revolution." She nodded. "The work continues, Mr. Secretary. This is just the beginning." She thought briefly of Mark Harrison for the first time in weeks. He was in a federal work release program, now having completed his 18-month sentence. He was working a low-wage job in a small town in West Virginia, learning humility the hard way. He was 50 years old, with a federal conviction and a destroyed reputation. He would never hold a position of authority again. She felt no triumph over his suffering, only resolution that justice had been served, that he understood finally what it meant to be vulnerable, what it meant to have power stripped away, what it meant to face real consequences. But more than that, she thought about the thousands of passengers who would now travel with dignity, about the young officers who would be trained to see people as human beings rather than threats, about the culture that was changing one interaction at a time. Isabella kept the 2 pieces of her destroyed passport in a clear resin case on her desk, not as a trophy, not as a symbol of revenge, but as a reminder of that morning when she was reduced to a hoodie and sweats, when someone decided she was nobody, when she sat on that plastic bench and felt something shift from fury to resolve. But more than that, it was a reminder of what changed. Not Mark Harrison's life, though yes, he lost everything. But that was not the point. The point was that a young woman would board a plane tomorrow at JFK and she would not be profiled. She would not be humiliated. She would not be made to feel like she did not belong. Because Isabella refused to let what happened to her happen to anyone else. That is the real victory. That is the transformation that stayed with her. She looked at her calendar. 3 meetings with airport operations. 2 calls with the training firm implementing the new program across other airports. 1 presentation at a police academy about de-escalation. The work continued. She took out her phone and texted Arthur. "Run the quarterly numbers. I want to see if discrimination complaints stayed down or if they are creeping back up." Vigilance is constant work, because the work was not finished. Justice was not a destination. It was a practice. Every day, in every interaction, people had to choose dignity or domination. She had chosen dignity, and she would keep choosing it, knowing exactly what happened when someone chose otherwise. Some days she still felt the ghost of that humiliation, but now it had a purpose. Now it meant something. Now it protected someone else. Thank you for listening to this story of courage, dignity, and justice. What Mark Harrison did that morning was wrong. But his story is not really about one man's cruelty. It is about a culture that allowed cruelty to flourish unchecked. And more importantly, it is about what happens when someone refuses to accept that cruelty as normal. Isabella Torres did not respond with rage. She responded with strategy. She did not respond with destruction. She responded with transformation of the culture itself. And that distinction matters. Real justice is not about making someone suffer as much as they made you suffer. Real justice is changing the environment so nobody has to suffer what you suffered. This story should remind us all of something important. You never know who you are talking to. That person you decide to humiliate might have power you do not understand. But more importantly, that person deserves dignity, not because of their power, but because they are human. If this story moved you, if you are inspired by Isabella's refusal to accept injustice, if you believe that dignity should be a right and not a privilege, please hit that like button. Help us reach more people with this important message. Subscribe to our channel right now. Click that subscribe button because we have more stories coming every single week where ordinary people do extraordinary things to create real change. You do not want to miss what happens next. And share this video. Share it with someone who needs to be reminded that dignity matters. Share it with someone who has been treated unfairly. Share it with your friends and family. Share it with your community. Because these stories need to reach as many people as possible. When you share this video, you are spreading the message that justice is possible, that one person can change an entire system, that consequences are real, and that accountability works. Drop a comment below and tell us your story. Have you ever witnessed someone stand up to injustice? Have you ever been the person who stood up? What did you learn from it? We want to hear from you. Your stories matter. Your voice matters. Your courage matters. Because together we are building a world where no one is treated as less than human because of how they look or where they come from. Together we are demanding dignity. Together we are creating change. Together we are showing that standing up to injustice is not just possible. It is necessary. It is powerful. It is the only way we move forward. Thank you for watching Unheard Truth Stories. Thank you for caring. Thank you for believing that change is possible. Now go out there and be the change. Be the voice. Be the one who stands up. Be the one who refuses to accept injustice as normal. Because the world needs people like you.